Alright, it's been 2 days since Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday holiday came up, and I need to make another video, so now's a really good time to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. Because the mainstream media, they do really want to talk about how he was such a great nonviolent civil rights leader, how he did a lot to make sure that the U.S. government would actually back up black people and make sure they would actually support and make sure that black people get the civil rights of that they should have gotten right after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, I should say, when they were made free people and not slaves. And then he was also able to push Congress to sign the Voting Rights Act to make sure that black people actually have the right to go out and vote for whichever candidate or candidates they wanted. And the local governments, or the state government, I could say, aren't allowed to say, oh, well, Mr. Black Man or Mr. Black Woman, Miss Black Woman, I'm going to give you a test to make sure that you can read and write well enough to vote, or any other racist barrier they wanted to put in place to make sure they stop black people from voting. Well, Kyle Kalinske and at least one or two other small independent news show hosts, they talked about how the mainstream media does not want to talk about how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was also a socialist, and he pushed to make the society more of a socialist society where the government's actually ensuring that people aren't living in poverty. Because in this nation, the richest nation in the face of the earth, and it was still one of the richest nations back then in the 60s, with all this material wealth, why is it that it's always black people, or always a fair amount of the population is sitting in poverty, when we have the resources and the material wealth to make sure there is no poverty in the United States? We might not be able to solve it for the whole world, but the United States can actually fix the poverty situation in the United States. And Counterpunch has a really good article. It's a really long article, so I can't even really dig into a lot of it in this video because it just take too long. Plus, I want to talk about two other news stories too. But there's a few important statements that this author wrote that Dr. Martin Luther King did talk about. And one point is that Dr. King rejected the myths of U.S. society. He rejected its madmen packaging itself as the leader of the free world to tell it like it is, that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And the author also wrote that Dr. King saw the Negro Revolution as part of a third world and world revolution. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. For years, I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the South. A little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a radical reconstruction of the entire society. A revolution of values. So you could call him a revolutionary, not just a civil rights leader, because just a few small changes with making sure that schools were desegregated and other public places like restaurants and restrooms and so forth. Those were important to make sure that black people had equal rights and got their dignity taken care of, but there was still a lot more problems with society that really needed a lot more change than just those important changes. I'm also going to include a small clip of Dr. Martin Luther King putting on him being in front of the camera and doing some speeches, or this is just clips of him doing different speeches, and him talk about how we need to have a more social society where we're actually making sure we're taking care of people that are poor whites and poor blacks, because we have the material needs to be able to do that. And if we have the material resources to do it and we're not. He's saying we're just morally just missing the ball on that. And that's really unacceptable. And then he also directly talks about how we need to get out of the Vietnam War because we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to kill people over in Vietnam, but we're barely spending $100 on each person to lift them out of poverty. And that's a crime against humanity, to spend a lot more money to kill somebody than to make sure you make somebody's life better here.
We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor. The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yes, yes. All labor has dignity. Yes. But you're doing another thing. You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And the question is whether America will do it. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. And the real question is whether we have the will.
And then a big issue that we've come to terms to in the last 2 or 3 years is our overbearing police state. And Dr. King's, especially the end of his life, really reveals the fact that we had a overbearing police state back then in the 60s and throughout all those times that the police state have been working to really control or to limit opposition to the establishment and how our society is organized right now. And they're really not really working for the people of the United States. So I want to go into it right here. King was a victim of capitalist state violence, surveillance, psychological character, and actual assassination. The story of J. Edgar Hoover's campaign to destroy Martin Luther King and force him into a nervous breakdown and suicide is not tangential but central to King's revolutionary history. the surveillance and police state we live under today. And yet another element of the revolutionary history of Dr. King is that it's being whitewashed as his actual assassination was by the system itself. Part of this cover-up is to destroy the memory of the work of Coretta Scott King and exposing the actual assassination of Dr. King. And then I wanted to talk about the Laquan McDonald case because the officer just got sentenced, and this ties directly into Dr. Martin Luther King's how black people are being they've been shackled by discrimination and oppression, because a lot of these cases that have been going on in the last couple of years about black men, especially black teenagers, getting gunned down by police, some having a knife or something, a lot of them having nothing at all. A lot of those officers, no convictions, no nothing. Sometimes they got kicked out of that police force, but of course that's not nearly enough of a punishment for killing somebody just because they're black. And actually, it's really murder, because when you watch those videos, they really shouldn't have killed those black men, because oftentimes they're just standing there, maybe they're running away, and a police officer's job is not to kill somebody just because they happen to have a knife or just because they happen to have a gun in the car. Their job is not to kill people. It's not to be executioner just because they're fucking scared. And another thing is they shouldn't be scared just because a black man has a knife or a gun. Because oftentimes a white man has a gun or a knife and they're not gunning them down. So that's where some of this revolutionary actions and why we need a revolution. Alright, let's start with the story. On Friday, Chicago Police Department officer Jason Van Dyke was sentenced to less than 7 years, 18 months in prison, plus 2 years probation for the 2014 murder of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. The sentence was handed down by Cook County Circuit Court Judge Vincent Gauna 1 day after 3 CPD officers were found not guilty of conspiracy charges stemming from their role in covering up the murder of the African-American teen. Van Dyke is the first Chicago police officer to be convicted of murder during an on-duty assault in more than half a century. Van Dyke was convicted in October 2018 by a jury of second-degree murder, 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm, one for every bullet Van Dyke unloaded to McDonald's body over a 15-second period. Van Dyke could have received up to 20 years for second-degree murder and between 6 and 30 years for each count of aggravated battery. He was given the full sentence. He could have been in prison for the rest of his life. The minimal sentence can only be understood as the action of a ruling class that needed to sentence Van Dyke to avoid eruption of social anger, but did not want to set a precedent that might limit the ability of the police to act with the utmost violence. In that last sentence, the socialist website just author wrote right there just really explains why most of these officers aren't even getting convicted for, aggravated assault whenever they're murdering a lot of these black men. That's because they're really keeping this policy in place of making sure that black people are second-class citizens, and the police really need to use the utmost violence to make sure that black people's status stays in place how it is, because that will really crumble the power of the elite. Is if black people really are able to get the power that they deserve, and that's to have as much power as white people have. The article goes more into detail about the case, and that's not really what I'm wanting to cover right now. But of course, I'll leave a link in the description box so you can read this article, the article about Martin Luther King, and of the other story I'm going to do. But the end of this article does talk about how a real conspiracy was the police officers that got off without being charged with conspiracy for hiding the murder talks about the how those three officers, they went to Burger King parking lot close to where the murder happened, and what they did was they deleted the footage when they were reviewing it. Then I'm pretty sure that the dash cam footage of this murder was also released weeks after the murder happened, because the Chicago Police Department was obviously trying to cover up and try to paint it as it wasn't a murder. The officer was actually trying to use self-defense. The same old bullshit they always do. But one thing that is very apparent is that we need a revolution of our criminal justice system, because it's really working to make sure the power structures stay in place, and to make sure that black people know that they could get killed and the police officers could be left off. They could be let off, no problems. Then I also wanted to do a news video, or just do the story of the Democrats rejecting President Trump's proposal to end the government shutdown, because the shutdown has still been going on, and Congress is just horrible because their main job is to keep the federal government running and create a yearly budget, and they still haven't done that. And they're all pretty shitty for not even being able to do the basics of being a Congress member, is making sure the government stays running. Because there's a few, I looked it up, there's a few things that federal government's in charge of. Even though it's a partial government shutdown, so the government can still do a lot of its essential functions. Still, plenty of important functions aren't being filled in right now. Oh, because one critical part about the federal government is they do all the regulations around air flight. So a lot of the traffic controllers, those are federal employees. So that hasn't been operating like normal. TSA agents, that's the biggest thing, because they've been talking about that on NPR for the last week or two, is all those TSA agents, they're not getting paid right now. And NPR is talking about, what are these federal workers, what are they doing in the meantime, and things like that. So for a lot of these federal employees, it's pretty rough, because they're living paycheck to paycheck, and they're going to miss their second paycheck. So I feel for all those workers, and hopefully Congress can actually change some of how they're organized, to make sure that all the federal workers are automatically paid for a partial government shutdown. Congress should be able to make sure there's really not any partial government shutdowns ever, but that's still one thing they really need to do, is one, make sure they all get paid no matter what, and they also need to up their wages anyway, because they're barely making $16 or $17 an hour. All those federal employees need to be making that much money, because they're producing that much value of services to the public. So that's really going to help out them and their families. It's also going to help out their communities by making sure they're not living in poverty or living paycheck to paycheck. So that's one thing that the federal government should do. In the Justice Department, they're not able to do anything right now. So any federal cases, they're not getting seen right now. So there's going to be a backlog of that. Also, the Food and Drug Administration, they've been shut down for the most part. So a lot of the inspections they do for food, they're not able to do that at all. So let's just cross our fingers. Hopefully nothing serious is contaminated, so then we won't have as much of a system to really alert the public and really stop any contaminated food from getting through the food system. Because we just had the lettuce contamination from Arizona a little while ago, maybe a couple months ago. So hopefully there's nothing like that is going to come through soon. Also, the EPA, they're also not getting any funding, so they're not able to really protect our environment. But another issue is that the EPA hasn't really been gutted or been co-opted by big corporations, so they're not as strong as they really should be. But either way, them being shut down is really gonna hurt the public safety. So hopefully hopefully Congress and the president could get the government started within the next couple of days. And I'm a little surprised that Democrats haven't caved, but I'm also thinking they're gonna wait to make sure that the Republicans agree to just start the government back up, and then they're gonna cave in to fund the stupid ass border wall. Of course, they shouldn't do that at all, because the border wall is really an arcane solution to a new age problem of, and actually we're also creating the problem of, we're sending violence over to South America, Central America, and a lot of those people are fleeing the violence that we're perpetrating by having our government go down there and fund those governments to keep the drug wars going on. And the drug wars is creating a lot of chaos and violence for the people there, so they flee. They're going to different countries. They're immigrating to Mexico too. It's not just they're coming to the United States. So in fact, we are creating our own worst problem, or what a lot of conservatives would say, it's a horrible problem of illegal immigration. But some of that is our government's fault. So I think that's a little bit ironic that we're the cause of some of our own problems.